All right, launching into chapter 2, Jesus and the Old Testament. Very important, as we've already established that the New Testament approach to the Old Testament was redefined in some ways away from normal Jewish interpretive practices, though it was in continuity in some ways with those practices. It had been transformed by relocating the center of their circumambient traditional understanding upon the person of Jesus. And so Longenecker says here the authority of Christ undergirds the doctrine and practice of the earliest Christians and is reflected throughout the New Testament. Convinced of his messiahship and lordship, the early believers began with Jesus as the certain and known quantity. And so, with that being the interpretive approach of the early church, now we're digging into how did Jesus then himself use the Old Testament, and how does that influence how we experience the New Testament's use of the Old Testament. The trick is that the only way to know about Jesus' use of the Old Testament is to look at the New Testament. And so the question arises, when we see Jesus' quotations of the Old Testament and engagement of the Old Testament material, are we actually seeing Jesus' own words and how he actually used the Old Testament, or are we just coming into contact with how the early church was using it? Does Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and John record Jesus' words accurately, or are they summarizing? Because didn't Jesus teach and speak in Aramaic at least the vast majority of the time? And we don't have Jesus's words in Aramaic. We have it in Greek. And so the question arises, when we're reading Jesus's quotations in the New Testament, are we reading his actual words, or just the how the early church used it? Which, by the way, that's one of the phrases maybe difficult to process. I'd spent time on this sentence that said, "It will not do to say." This is on page 47 and 48. It will not do to say, as is commonly asserted, that Jesus' Septuagint quotations indicate that they are simply part and parcel of the early church's Gemeindetheologia. Theologia. I don't know how to say it. Therefore, probably not dominical. What he's saying is, we can't just say that what we read about Jesus' quotations in the Gospels is only reflective of the early church community's understanding and not actually attributable to Jesus himself. Because one of the things that he draws out there on page 48 is why does Matthew, in his quotations, like when Matthew in his narrative asides says this was done to fulfill the scripture that says, his quotations seem more Semitic, more Hebrew, whereas the vast majority of Jesus's quotations are Septuagintal. So what is up with that? And we can't just say, why does Matthew do his quotations one way, but then record Jesus's quotations another way? That doesn't seem to follow that it was the New Testament culture had different ways of using the Old Testament. So yeah. But backing up a little bit, super interesting that in some cases, Jesus's use of the Old Testament is Septuagintal in nature, not Hebrew, and that the point Jesus is making is dependent on the Septuagintal form of the Old Testament. That's, on page 45 and 46, Longenecker talks about that. This is kind of a big deal. Like, what does this say to the verbal plenary view of inspiration that says that the Bible in its original documents in the exact words that that's actually the Holy Scriptures. Jesus didn't use, if the exact words were Hebrew, which certainly the first time they were ever written down, certainly it was in Hebrew and not in Greek. Jesus didn't use those Hebrew words. He used the Greek, at least on the pens, the mouths of the gospel writers. And in some cases, the argument Jesus is making is dependent on the Septuagint's view, representation of that verse. So to understand Jesus's point, Jesus had to move not from the Hebrew but from the Greek. So was that Greek biblical passage inspired or not? Why did Jesus, if only the original Hebrew is inspired, why did Jesus use the Greek? And then you get over into Luke chapter 4 when Jesus is quoting from Isaiah 61, blending in a little bit of Isaiah 58, and also presenting the text in a way that's not found anywhere else. And Luke says that Jesus stood up, unrolled the scroll, and read. So is Luke not true in saying that Jesus read that scroll? Because that scroll represents no text that we have on hand. Or did Jesus have this other scroll that is different than anything that we have? And Jesus said, this scripture is now fulfilled in your hearing. So Jesus is calling scripture a form of the text that we don't even have, but is definitely not the original Hebrew. So there's lots of questions that are raised in looking at how Jesus used the Old Testament.